Welcome everyone to this new event in our ELSI webinar series entitled Biobanking with Children. BBMRI ERIC facilitates access to samples and data collections across Europe to advance biomedical research. We rely on a network of national nodes in the member countries and a professional network of interdisciplinary experts. The ELSI Services and Research Unit provides support concerning ethical, legal, and societal issues to our national nodes and project partners. We conduct research on a series of relevant topics, such as GDPR compliance or ethics of AI. We support the biobanking community about regulatory requirements and best practice standards. We participate in projects, and we have also the ELSI Help Desk and our ELSI knowledge base to provide this support. This presentation is co-funded by CY Biobank, and we thank this project for their support. Today, we have two wonderful speakers, Sara Casati and Bridget Elul. Sara Casati is a bioethicist who loves participatory approaches and deliberative methods. She sees bioethics as a process of democratization of science, and she is a part of ELSI Research and Services Unit and a part of BBMRI Italy. She is the lead of the Task Force Research Ethics Committees. Bridget Elul is a medical graduate with an interest in medical law and bioethics. She is an ELSI advisor at the Center for Molecular Medicine and Biobanking, which represents the University of Malta as the BBMRI Malta node. She is working on issues related to informed consent, and she is a member of the Task Force Research Ethics Committees that Sara leads, contributing with her extensive experience working on research ethics committees. We will now start with their presentation on biobanking with children, and then it will be followed by a Q&A session. Please, Bridget, Sara, it is your turn to take the lead. Perfect.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you very much for this opportunity of open dialogue, and thank you, Bridget, for being such a valuable companion in this fascinating journey. I've been learning a lot, just as I'm sure I'll learn so much thanks to the fruitful discussion this afternoon. Biobanking with children, the with sounds strange, odd in English, and a bit in practice as well. But we are going to share with you how this with means a shift, cultural, ethical, and scientific, a change that could be a great chance. Biobanking with children should prove the ideal training ground for both the responsible research and the innovation and the scientific citizenship engagement processes, fostering the change of pace for collaborative and participatory research. Well, what is in it for you? You might learn about an outline of the regulatory background, ethical issues specific to biobanking in children, but we might understand together the need to change biobanking processes and attitude in all players engaged in biobanking with children within a participatory horizon. In a nutshell, as children grow and mature, so must the attitude of all the players. And with all the players, we mean not just parents, but also biobanker researchers, such that a dynamic sense of empowerment is promoted and maintained in the biobanking extending community. We will highlight as this shift reshapes the regulatory framework in terms of recognition, inclusion, and ELSI maturation, above all, that of adults again, and we will deep the ethical issues specific to minors related to vulnerability, the development factor, as well as the dynamic consent process at stake. Tackling the informational risk, we face some special rights, such as the right to an open future and the right of return of results. But most importantly, we will recognize that without engagement of all the actors involved, minors and adults, there is no sustainable, fair biobanking over time. So a change of pace where there is our ELSI maturation with minors at stake. Here there is a paradigm shift which over time has permeated our regulatory framework as well. It has been being a not obvious process, deconstructing patterns along a journey of inclusion and recognition of the minor as a participant. Those opinions must be taken into account and those dissent must be respected. At the same time, it outlines the path of making researchers and biobankers aware of their own role in increasing the risk of vulnerability and discrimination of minors involved in biobank-based research, if not acted upon responsibly, inclusive, and guarantor of empowerment capability settings. Two warnings in our journey. The first, the regulatory framework revolves primarily around clinical trials, biomedical research in the strict sense. We will trace the ELSI evolution of the child as well as the adult, professional or guardian, using the tool of analogy in relation to biobanking. In fact, only in 2006, the Council of Europe will publish, as we see, the first recommendation on biobanking or research on biological material of human origin. The second warning, the regulatory framework has been built up over 50 years, basically thanks to soft law, which promote and recommend, but do not impose good practice and fairness in research biobanking at the European level. We have not a regulation on biobanking at the European level. As I share, it is a slow but progressive change from the Nuremberg Code that excluded the so-called incompetent people from research to recent was the memory of the Action T4 as of the experiment with the most vulnerable in the concentration fields to the Oviedo Convention that establishes that the opinion of the minor shall be taken into consideration as an increasingly determining factor in proportion to his or her age and degree of maturity. 50 years to deconstructing the paternalistic paradigm in order to include the other, the vulnerable, the most protected subject, to respect him or by providing and encouraging processes and tools of self-determination, such as assent, dissent, and reconsent are. Also, paternalistic temptation persists. It's something that we are, of what we have to be aware. One of which is the so-called best interest of child, for instance, introduced by conventional rights of children. Who decides this best interest? It will be one of our recurring questions. Who decides? In any case, in 1970, the Belmont Report, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research produced it, marks this delicate transition where reflecting the principle of respect for persons highlights that the capacity for self-determination matures during an individual's life. Respect for the immatures may require protecting them as they mature, beyond making sure they undertake activities freely and with awareness of the possible adverse consequences. Respect for persons requires that subject, to the degree that they are capable, be given the opportunity to choose what shall or shall not happen to them. This opportunity is provided when adequate standards for informed consent are satisfied, in particular comprehension, and we will go in depth talking of comprehension and minors comprehension in particular. And special provision may need to be made when comprehension is severely limited, for example, by condition of immaturity tailored processes. Here we find some cornerstone in advance, balancing protection and capacitation, safeguarding and including at the same time, tailoring processes and tools to facilitate comprehension. Well, we said 50 years of slow progression. when everything speeds up. From protection to recognition, it was 2000 year, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union balances the right to protection and care of children with the duty to take them seriously and to cope them according to their age and the degree of maturity. In particular, in Article 24, it statutes that children shall have the right to such protection and care as is necessary for their well-being, but they may express their views freely. Such views shall be taken into consideration on matters which concern them in accordance with their age and maturity. The same that we found in the Oviedo Convention. But it's the regulation on clinical trial that really changed this space. That makes definitely the difference, going well beyond the European Directive 2001 number 20. The regulation explicitly requires that children and young people should take part in the consent process. The minor participates while the legally designated representative authorize his or participation. The regulation is also crucial, clearly articulating how informed consent is a process configured by researchers or research team members trained or experienced in working with children, competent in working with children. This is a pillar. Informed consent can only be shared with by competent and qualified personnel. Finally, we come to the recommendation for biobank-based research, strongly in dialogue with the content of the Oviedo Convention and its additional protocols. Well, we can say that Oviedo Convention is our Bible, our constitution in terms of biomedical research or research with humans. In Article 12, the recommendation states that if the person not able to consent is a minor, his or her opinion should be taken into consideration as an increasingly determining factor in proportion to age and degree of mature. It sounds familiar now, this concept. Moreover, at the point 5, where a person not able to consent, those biological material have been stored for future research, attains or regains the capacity to consent, reasonable effort should be made to seek the consent of that person for continued storage and research use of his or biological material. Here, we have the concept of reconsent. It's the first time that this concept, very important, a pillar for biobanking with children, is introduced. And it's really interesting to go to the guideline 17 on research involving children and adolescents, co-produced by CHOMS and WHO, that in a certain way sums up all these ELSI turning points, and in particular underline how children and adolescents must be included in health-related research, unless a good scientific reason justify their exclusion. And before undertaking research involving children and adolescents, so prior, the researcher and the research ethics committee must ensure that a parent or a legally authorized representative of the child or adolescent has given permission and the agreement, assent, of the child or adolescent has been obtained in keeping with the child's or adolescent capacity, after having provided with adequate information about the research tailored to the child's or adolescent level of maturity. And how to summarize this process, including our LCRRI maturation with and thanks the minors? Well, maybe just with one sentence, that the minor is the participant, not the parents, not the guardians, and that our duty, our responsibility to include and recognize children and adolescents not only as subject of rights, but as interlocutor and participant. Well, in a nutshell, it is both an ELSI duty and responsibility and an amazing cultural investment to promote a capability approach to equip minors and indirectly adults, their parent, but also the researcher, the biobanker, the components of the members of the research ethics committee to understand and to act with awareness in the new scientific horizon based on data and sample access and use. Moreover, as pediatric biobank-based research grows, and we need an ethically healthy balance between the protection of vulnerable population and the development of a fair, reproducible, in terms of reproducible, accessible, interoperable research, but also fair in terms of an inclusive, responsible research. In the age of the genomic medicine, it is critical to support researchers in rethinking the consent process with minors, stressing that older children and adolescents, the mature minors, are often capable of meaningful deliberation about the risks and benefits of participation in such an impacting research. And this will be key, talking of rights within a capability horizon, as well as how to deal with the vulnerability and to acknowledge the specificity of the child as a vulnerable person in transition. Now we are trying to share something more on vulnerability and in which sense it's a special vulnerable population, the children population. The etymology of the word vulnerability is linked to the aspect of possibility. Vulnerable is who could potentially be injured. Consequently, the Barcelona Declaration highlights that the vulnerable are those autonomy or dignity or integrity are capable of being threatened. As such, all beings who have dignity are protected by this principle. But the principle also specifically requires that these vulnerable receive assistance to enable them to realize their potential. Vulnerable ask for empowerment, for capabilities. Again, also in this very, very important document by National Bioethics Advisory Commission, so by USA, again, the intimate relationship between the increased risk of vulnerability and the lack of informed consent, and how our responsibility is to create empowerment, informational and enabling setting in order not to expose to an increased risk of vulnerability minors and in general vulnerable. In its last version, in the 2013, ELSI Declaration focuses on vulnerable groups and individuals and highlight as a vulnerability occurs along a spectrum. A particular situation or a particular characteristic of a person may place a person at greater or lesser risk of harm, as we have seen. The REC, the Biobank, has said are charged with ensuring that additional safeguards to protect both the rights and well-being of subjects included in the study under review. To make this determination, they may be advised to consider two questions. Is inclusion necessary? And if so, are safeguards adequate? So there are two crucial, critical linked actions at stake: inclusion and safeguarding. And going through our dynamic regulatory framework, additional protocol to the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine concerning biomedical research, additional protocol to the Oviedo Convention, again, status that the research entails has to entail only minimal risk and minimal burden for the individual concerned, as well as the recommendation in the last version on research on biological materials of human origin. Minimal risk is something that is directly related to research with vulnerable, and is something that we have to assess every time. In order to reduce vulnerability and to include, in particular, our special vulnerable that such the minor is vulnerable in transition. In the ongoing debates about pediatric biobanking and research, it is essential to define what safeguards and oversight are set up to protect the minors. But one recognizes that there may be tension between protection measures and scientific research progress, as well as parents' expectation in terms both of tailored diagnosis and treatment, and between obligation to protect and hope to discover. This conflict of interest causes tension and can enhance the minor's vulnerability if not assumed with responsibility by adults and within an ELSI paradigm shift that moving from a paternalistic model to a participatory one. Moreover, although children are vulnerable research population in the sense that at the beginning they lack the capacity for consenting to their participation, they are different from other vulnerable populations, such as people with cognitive problems. They are different because their vulnerability is temporary and does not arise from a disorder. Most children will become healthy adult members of society. Therefore, it is imperative that pediatric biobanking and research framework is based on empowerment processes, ensuring the minor's participation increases and progresses as maturity develops. Bridget, the floor and the slide are now yours.
Thank you, Sarah. So the mention of genetic research leads us nicely into looking at specifics of biobanking in pediatrics. This is because biobanking here is an ideal tool to ensure that the research does occur. Not only it is important for children who have disease, because obviously a lot of these diseases have a genetic cause. And in fact, a lot of rare diseases, 50%, occur in children. Not to mention that a large number of children who unfortunately die in the first year of life die because they are affected by a rare disease. But biobanking with children is also important to ascertain population genetics, particularly useful to correlate the complex interactions between genetic and environmental factors. So biobanking can occur from healthy participants, and one can state, well, there is hardly any direct benefit to these individuals who have agreed to participate. But obviously there is marked potential for helping peers or future participants. And in fact, at the same time, there is minimal risk, however, to these individuals. We've seen how important this is in terms of the regulatory mechanisms to ensure that there's minimal risk. On the other hand, biobanking from participants with active disease may provide some direct benefit to those individuals, though obviously it's much more likely to be of use in the future, where it will help to provide future treatments. And it is also important when the parents, or in fact, the children themselves, once they become adults, have to take reproductive decisions. As I've said, the minimal risks therefore offset helps to put the benefits in a much stronger position. Next slide, please. Thank you, Sarah. And here we come back to the recommendation, which we have already mentioned by the Council of Europe. And we are reiterating here that the benefits are important to, they have to be important either to the individual participant, but they can also be considered worthwhile if they are of benefit to other persons of the same age or have the same disease, particularly if the research can only be carried out in these children and could not be carried out in adults who are able to consent. Again, here is a reminder of that the risk should be minimal. One added point in the recommendation, which we haven't as yet seen, was that there is emphasis here that there should be official or legal consent from an authority or a person recognized under law. This is usually obviously the parent, but it could also be a guardian. But this consent has to be specific to the actual intervention, to the actual removal of the sample that's going to be provided to the biobank. And one has to be as precise as possible with regard to the envisaged use. And here, this could obviously give rise to problems, as we shall see, with the problem of obtaining consent and in the children assent. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we have looked, first of all, have followed the child from the role as a person just entitled to special care to one who now has their own wishes considered, and providing an opinion, providing assent, able to disagree. And this fulfills the ethical ethical consent. In this case of the child, this is actually assent with the parents or the guardian or the representative from acceptable under the local national legislation able to give the official consent. But the important point, this is a free choice for the minor, assisted, helped by the support of the adults. And biobanking here is really an important vector and a practical one of allowing the engagement, the participation of the children in research, and at the same time empowering them to learn to take decisions and more important opinions and decisions as they grow older. And we shall see what happens as the child develops. Next slide, please. So to be able to actually appreciate that the autonomy of the child is being respected, we have to appreciate that as they develop, their understanding increases, and even if the adults don't always agree with their ideas and their wishes, their opinions have to be taken into consideration and respected. This will give the child the chance to believe in themselves, to be more aware of their worth and their values, and this is obviously empowers them to behave as adults. Now, to be able to follow the child as they grow older, the concept of dynamic consent assumes a great importance because as you follow the child as they grow, you can increasingly dialogue with them about the research, get them involved and interested in consenting and agreeing to specific parts of the research process. So this is really an ideal situation to foster dynamic consent. You need, of course, the right tools, and you cannot give the same information at every age. And in fact, in practical terms, one has to develop the correct informational packages to suit the maturity of the child. I cannot say the age, as we shall see in the next slides. This is how do we assess what is the correct information to give to the child. Now, the regulatory instruments insist that information should be adequate, but also tailored to the maturity of the child. We've looked at guideline 17 from Chomps and WHO already. And this is important because you have to match this with the capacity to consent. And in this slide, you can see that there are 4 steps to capacity to consent. You have to understand the information, you have to apply it to yourself, see how this information affects you, and then you have to try and decide how it's going to affect you by looking at the pros and the cons. So this is sort of, there is rationality in the reasoning, and only then will the child be able to actually make a voluntary choice. This process changes as the child grows older and matures, and this development is not the same in all children. On practical terms, therefore, one has to, first of all, address simple elements of the study, like the practical aspects of where is the study going to take place, what is the protocol, what type of samples will be taken, will there be any pain in taking a blood sample, for example. And one leaves abstract concepts of ethics and data protection till later on. But obviously, the time frame has to change with individual children, and this can be an issue. Next slide, please. Because who decides what information to give to a particular child? Are the parents in the best position to assess at what stage of maturity these children are? We've heard already that the parents might actually have other interests in the research, particularly if there are genetic diseases involved. This might be of importance for the whole family. Not might be, this will surely be of importance for the whole family. There is also the possibility of therapeutic misconception, where the parents think that there's going to be unexplained and benefits for their actual child. So the parents might not actually be the best individuals to assess how much or what information to give. Should this responsibility be devolved to the research team? And by research team, I think one has to include the bigger picture. So it's a group of people involving the actual scientists and biobankers, maybe, with the minors and the parents or other adults who are involved. They have to take into consideration an ongoing process, a dynamic process, an evolving process as the child matures. So it's not a decision that has to be taken once. The information has to be given over a prolonged time and has to be increased in content and updated to be able to be understood by the child at that particular time. Of course, the minors and the parents can be will be in consultation and with the team, and this is the ideal practice, where you would have all stakeholders being involved over a period of time. Next, please. This is important because it balances the autonomy of the child with the legal rights of the parents. And this has led to the agreement of the child, labeled as assent, coming into the fore in regulatory instruments. This interaction between minors and parents will actually empower the children, make them more aware of their worth and their value, as we've already said. The role of the parents here is much more of being supportive and giving advice. Next, please. But legally, where do we stand? When should actually assent change to consent? Is there a legal age of maturity? Well, there is no uniform legal age of maturity in general in legislation throughout the world. There is even less agreement on what the legal age of consent for research should be. Even less than this, no consensus on age of assent, particularly in the EU. There has been some work, for example, with the working group on ethics, where the European Network of Pediatric Research, part of the European Medicines Agency, tried to establish what the different ages for assent were in Europe. Again, here this is work related to clinical trials. And in fact, in some countries, the assent was sought from children as young as 4 to 6 years. This follows also what usually is recommended in the States. It is useful to know that countries have tried to address an age for giving consent for health-related interventions, but usually not for research. Next, please. But even, I mean, this legal age rarely considers developing maturity. So this poses the next question: how are we to assess maturity? And pediatric researchers have tried to address this issue. And there was one study which showed some light on this problem, realized that there were two important aspects to assessing maturity. And one, which have already been mentioned, is the constant discussion, interaction between parents and the child to gauge the maturity of the child and the understanding rather of the child, as well as feedback to assess understanding. I mean, this feedback mechanism is usually a part of assessment of understanding anyway. And there are tools that are available. For example, this MACAT-CR is a tool that has got a specific number of questions which the child has to answer, or it's not just for children. And in fact, it was a tool used for adults who were not able to consent in psychiatric practice. But it has been used also to assess maturity in adolescents. The relationship between the parents and the children was found to be more important than actually using a specific tool. And of course, we know that recommendations require that the child, once they reach legal age, whatever that is in your own country, have to be recontacted to reconsent. Recontact and reconsent does have to happen whenever secondary use is envisaged, but this is a sine qua non in biobanking. And this notion of recontacting and reconsenting should be considered right at the start of sample collection. And if you have in place dynamic consent, this will make recontact much more easily possible. And in fact, with digital platforms nowadays, where you can have a program for dynamic consent and dynamic interaction, this becomes much more easy. The reconsent of children at legal age, which was first seen in the Council of Europe recommendation in 2016, is now crucial, important, and in fact, it's not a new idea, because even in the Declaration of Helsinki, which is related to the medical profession. The first time it mentions biobanks in the 2013 amendment, it actually specifically says that there must be informed consent for reuse. However, this opens up a possibility where when it becomes difficult or impossible to recontact the original participators, you can then ask a research ethics committee to review the situation. Now, this obviously, the Declaration of Helsinki is not a mandatory law, but this is a useful and important recommendation, which some countries have actually put into their national legislation. Next slide. Which leads me now to a definite regulatory instrument, a definite, which is law, and we're all aware of the General Data Protection Regulation, which focuses on data processing. This is meant to protect the participants or in research. Now, sample and it relates to data, but in biobanking, it is impossible to separate the data from the sample. And so this has led to some countries actually considering in their own legislation that the sample and the data in the biobank should be considered as one. But this is not uniform in all European countries. Important also to realize that there are two types of consent which must be clearly separated. The Declaration of Helsinki, research ethics committees, and the need for fair research requires ethically in consent. And this is what we consider usually as informed consent, where the person is given the right information so that they can make a choice of whether they want to be in the research. In this case, whether they want to have their sample in the biobank or not. This should be separated from the explicit legal consent required to be used as a legal basis for data processing under the GDPR. Of course, the GDPR has also the possibility of having other legal bases for data processing, mostly for example, for public interests. Or it does mention scientific interests, but these are actually tied down to the local legislation, recognizing these other methods as being an acceptable legal basis for research in that particular country. Next, please. And to look at some of the articles in the GDPR that actually refer specifically to minors. Article 12 talks about the information that should be given to participants in research, and it specifically talks about any information addressed to a child, and this information should be provided in writing. And on this slide, you are seeing actually a classical or typical format of what can be provided to a child who's actually providing their sample for a biobank or who's being involved in research. The information that is provided should always be to a person who's giving their personal data for processing, should always be clear and plain. The language should be understandable, and this is even more important when you are actually giving the information to a child. It has to be geared to their maturity. As an aside, Article 8 talks about the age of where parental consent is not required for use of digital services offered directly to the child. I mentioned this because of my previous indication of dynamic consent using web-based services, digital services, because indirectly one might have to consider this age. the GDPR mentions that it has to be set by the local state and not younger than 13 and between 13 and 16. Next slide, please. Still on the GDPR, where in the recitals, it mentions that children have to have safeguards, and they merit specific protection because of the vulnerability, which we've already heard about. So they will be less aware of the risks of providing a sample to the biobank, of the risks of future use of their sample. So they should actually have safeguards, and one of these could be counseling services. And in this instance, it goes on to say that you don't always need to have the consent of the parents for this. Another of the recitals talks about the rights of the individual to have their data erased or rectified. Now, obviously, as a child who's only given assent, they are unlikely to be in a position where they exercise this right. It would be the parent. But an important point added here is that when the child reaches the age of maturity or legal maturity, when they become an adult legally, they will still have that right even to erase or rectify their data, even if they had only given assent when they were still minors. And this is an important point. Next slide, please.
Thank you a lot, because we are going to the end of our sharing and focuses on two very specific rights related to children and biobanking with children. The first one is a right to an open future, and the second one will be returning results. Talking of this very special right to an open future, we are talking of benefit and informational risk before. In research biobanking with children, the question of benefit is complex and often in contradiction with the regulatory framework asking for a direct benefit when a vulnerable participant is involved in the research. In fact, biobank-based research generates generally potential benefit for future patients or long-term benefit for science and for society. Thus, the risk of exposure to harm is not automatically balancing with potential benefit derived from the research, especially since the risk involved may be informational, related to genetic profiling, to genetic analysis. And in particular, in the case of adult onset condition, parent choices cannot wait on child's future. So here we have a right to an open future, especially if genetic research may open up or preclude future possibility once the minor reaches the age of majority, or exposed or is early to discrimination, stigma or overprotection because of likely predisposition. In other words, exposing the minor to an increased risk of vulnerability. For the individual, the risk remains even when biological material has been used because the data continues to be accessible. It may already have been shared prior to reconsent at maturity. And in a nutshell, we can say that the right to an open future refers to the idea that children will become autonomous once they reach the age of majority, and therefore parent decision should be such as to ensure this occurs, and that this young adult can manage and decide for or his life. Well, the other very special and tricky, because it's not so easy to realize right at stake, the returning results. Well, we have some regulatory instrument that can help us, but again are all soft laws. So we can share together how here we have a great opportunity to promote, to implement best practices without obligation. It's an ethical obligation, not a legal obligation at stake, but it's really a key passage, because without engagement, we said from the very beginning, there is no biobanking over time, and we have to have on board parents as well as minor, and a child today will be an adult tomorrow, and so it's key to make accessible and to make accessible through transparent path the possibility to know which kind of results biobank-based research are produced or are going to produce. On one hand, we have the additional protocol on biomedical research, and here again we have a very key passage. Information relevant to the current or future health or quality of life of research participants must be offered to them within a framework of healthcare or counseling. Due care must be taken in order to protect confidentiality, to respect any wish of a participant not to receive such information. Because it's true, we have the right to know, to receive this result, but at the same time, the right not to know. We go back to this concept. On the other hand, the recommendation is very useful for our topic, because in Article 17 on individual feedback, the recommendation states that clear policies should be in place on feedback concerning findings that are relevant for health of persons resulting from the use of their biological material, including persons who, according to law, are not able to consent. So, what can we learn from this soft regulatory framework? That it's this topic, this right, is something that we have to share and address at time of consent, and that Biobank must have policy regarding return of results. It's something that we have to frame, to set in order to make possible. And here we have the black side of this, or the challenge side of this right of this process, make possible the same right. That parents are continually making many important decisions that affect their children's future, but in the case of biobank participation, the consequences of parents' choices may have unpredicted consequences decades later. Uncertainty about the probability of research funding can have quite an important impact, and parents may hope for definitive answer about their child's illness. They may use the research findings in making future decisions about their child's health and their own future family planning. But potential benefits from genetic testing research are mitigated and with as implication when the child will not develop disease until adulthood, as we have seen with the right to an open future. It's a very complex process, the process at stake, and we can tackle a conflict because there are different interests at stake. A potential conflict between parents and the same minor. Children may have different values than their parents and may not agree with certain research to which parents have no problem providing consent. we will understand that it's not an easy issue. It's something that is changing our mind. It's a shift, as we said from the very beginning. The debate is huge, and most experts say that parents should not have the right to decide about the right to know or not to know on behalf of their child. Moreover, a mature minor can decide independently to access his or fundings, and this is very, very important. In spite of the parents' decision. And here again, we have two very key turning points. In one hand, the importance of disagreement, of the minor's disagreement. On the other hand, the possibility to decide within an ethical consent framework, because of their maturity, their capability to assess risk and benefit is taken into consideration. And again, the floor is yours, Bridget.
Okay, Sarah, well, we have tried to see both sides of the picture, but unfortunately we are left with a lot of questions to answer about returning results for adult onset diseases. I mean, in a way, if the results are going to change the management of an ongoing disease, then there seems to be no medical or ethical reasons for not providing the information. The problems arise when the genetic disease does not arise until the child becomes an adult. There are no easy answers here, and I think these questions should be addressed before the participants are have agreed to actually give the sample and take part in research. But here are some of them anyway. Should the parents have the right to choose? And we've heard reasons why this can be problematic, because obviously there's the child's autonomy and they have a right to choose for themselves. Should there be a policy of non-disclosure? If the parents choose, does this conflict with their their child's right when they become adults? Anyway, what if there is disagreement between the players? The parents' refusal to know the child's results, this might conflict with the best interest of the child. If this is recognized by the research team, what should they do? Can they overrule the parents' decision? Should the child be allowed always to exercise a right not to know? Or should the research team actually feel or argue that it's in the interest of the child to know? So it's obviously beyond the scope of this presentation to try and find answers. And I think the important message to take home is that for each individual research project that is envisaged, these questions should be considered in terms of the possibilities of the results that are expected to come out of the research. The more you think about this in future, at the beginning, the easier it becomes. Let's change track now, and our final thoughts are about empowerment and engagement. So I hope we have convinced you that it is important for the child and the family to engage together in pediatric biobank research together with the researchers and biobankers. This will promote, this interaction will ensure long-term participation of the research participants, will also help in sustaining the biobank, because of course this involvement is over a long time and you want the samples to be reused over and over again. Best practices, these must go beyond just providing information to the participants. We must involve all the stakeholders, and we've here included advocacy groups. We haven't had time to talk about them, but obviously they're important in helping the participants and the parents. there have been examples of successful examples of lay people, in inverted commas, but persons who have experience of either pediatrics or of pediatric research or of particular diseases in children, and they have been helping on access committees or in writing protocols for pediatric research. We must also give the minors themselves the opportunity to be involved in the actual research. Besides allowing them to ask questions, they can also be involved in the practical aspects of, for example, where the samples are taken, whether in hospital or in a clinic. They have quite fixed ideas. There have been studies to show that involving children in this aspect does help the whole research team to move forward. And of course, we must involve the participants in the likely future developments. This is not an easy task. It requires training of the research staff, the biobankers. It requires resources. It requires time. Probably this is the least available time. But this way, this communication and sharing between parents, who are the legal guardians, will build trust, will facilitate in informed consent, and also will make reconsenting much easier later on. Once a researcher acknowledges that the child's right to personalized assent, they have a moral duty to make a best effort to engage the child. And I emphasize this because we have been seeing this discussion has been mostly from the viewpoint of children and parents, but increasingly we recognize that the researchers' attitudes also have to change if we want to get the best out of pediatric biobanking. Yes, the researcher can assess the participants' understanding, the children's understanding of the research, the benefits and the risks, but always as part of a research team. Next, please. So in practice, here are some practical examples. There could be engagement with patient or citizen advocacy groups, scientific citizenship. This is becoming a more common aspect in local scientific encouragement. It opens doors to the bank. Here, this picture is actually an example of having young people attending the biobank to find out what is happening. These organized programs should start in school. They should be relevant to age. Of course, we can use drama and art, not just pure science, and also involvement in scientific events where even school and young groups, young children's groups can take part. There are also engagement tools that have been produced for particular age groups and for particular maturity, and these can vary from cartoons, videos, and games, and various other digital means. And this should hopefully lead to a change in attitude. A change in attitude of the minor, who is now considered as a partner, not a donor. There's cross-engagement with all the participants. There's this element of scientific citizenship and complete commitment of the participant. This is to try and make sure that the children get what they want from the professionals. And a sort of picture here is showing consent, information, etc. So the take-home message, that's all right. The take-home message, this take-home message to facilitate the use of biological samples and data in order to optimize scientific, economic, and social value. We haven't really had time to discuss this, but obviously biobanks are in a great position to actually ensure that this happens, because they are obviously also doing this important genetic research for society. The role of biobanks is particularly therefore relevant in pediatrics, and this last slide is actually giving us the rationale for having dedicated pediatric biobanks. 3 main points. Children are unique, they are not miniature adults, and I hope you have now you are with us on this point. They have specific biological, physiological changes. There are ethical changes because they are vulnerable and they are maturing, but they also have special rights which need to be safeguarded. Second point, we need the involvement of the extended families directly and indirectly together with the research team. Third point, networking. The networking between biobanks will maximize the use of small and scarce biological samples, will optimize collaboration, and obviously you need skilled and trained personnel, and you also need to network with the regulatory authorities, the policymakers, and the advocacy groups.
Well, can I add a fourth point?
Okay, Sarah.
But well, maybe it's a dream, but maybe it's also the right time to realize this dream. But if it's true what we are trying to share, we can design and co-produce best practices with minors, and it's something that can make the difference. Till now, we explore and study a lot of tools and also templates to better involve minors, but most of these tools, most of these practices are produced by adults. So here there is, well, an innovative
yes,
action and challenge. It's a challenge of co-production. It's something that is related to engagement and related to empowerment of every player involved in this incredible adventure that is biobanking with children.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, both of you, Sarah, Bridget, for this very, very interesting presentation of a very complex topic. And you have presented very important questions to think about how to create participatory and empowering processes of engagement with minors considered as partners and as participants, and to be able to do biobanking with children, and to also co-produce these best practices with minors, as Sarah was dreaming at the end. And I think that there could be a million questions to ask you about this topic, but I have a couple of questions and that maybe you can briefly answer. One question would be about the reasonable efforts to obtain reconsent. What should we understand by that, by these reasonable efforts? And what if reconsent cannot be obtained? Should we then destroy the biological material and data?
Thank you, Monica. Yes, reasonable efforts. Well, I think the most important issue about reconsent is to think about it at the beginning, at the time you're actually obtaining consent for the provision of the sample. So you have to put in your informed consent sheets the reason why you need to reconsent the children when they reach maturity or legal age. It's also, we have seen that the Council of Europe recommendation in 2016, they really emphasized that this is important. And in fact, to answer the last bit, I mean, you can't, if one is unable to obtain consent, there is the possibility of looking towards the research ethics committees if this is allowed in your country. So national legislation might be involved in how to proceed. Now, reasonable efforts, obviously you have to get the personal contact information from the individuals. You can emphasize to them that this is in their interest to keep it up to date. So if they're changing address, if they're changing emails, they should inform the biobank. You could, if it's really something important, you could have put an advert on the biobank website trying to contact people, or on social media, or even on public adverts, if it's something that is important to do. However, I think this would be reasonable. Don't you agree, Sarah? Is there anything else to add? I think the Research Ethics Committee position is not applicable, unfortunately, in all countries. It tends to rely on whether nationally this is an accepted avenue or not.
Yeah, well, I can add to consideration the first on the first step. As Bridget said, reconsent is not a whim, a concession. It's the best practice, and it's something that nowadays we have to tackle. It's something that how to frame our biobanking process with children. We know that children will be adult in few years. First of all, this is the very, very key turning point. And well, how to make accessible sample from the past, because when this question can be related to the so-called, in Italy we say ancient collection, the historical collection, and when we didn't think of, sorry?
Archives.
Yeah, archives. When we didn't think, we didn't train ourselves to prior frame our practice in terms of reconsenting. Well, as the Helsinki Declaration and recommendation highlight, we can reuse this sample under condition if there is a positive opinion by an ethical committee, but it depends on, as Bridget say, on your own country. For example, in Italy, we have to have also permission by the privacy authority. So it depends on your own country. But the very important point is to the first step, to think you are biobanking with children in view, within an horizon of reconsenting, within a dynamic process. So there are other questions, Monica?
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah, and Bridget for this answer. One question is about recontacting participants, that recontacting requires information on the individual, and that, of course, generates a conflict with data privacy issues because anonymization of samples and data is no longer possible. How might this issue be handled?
Well, I can say, maybe then Bridget can say more, but it's really related to the first one. This question is related to the first one. We have at stake there is the reconsent more than the recontact. Moreover, we talk a lot of genetic analysis, genetic research, and how biobanking is the needed basis to develop this type of research, and now this type of research is really key for children when there are no diagnoses, there are no treatments, for example, especially in rare disease field. But if it's true what I'm saying, anonymization is not the best practices. Most of the patient organizations are asking for pseudonymization because they want to receive. They want that special important rights that is they want to exercise the returning results right. So Bridget, what do you think of this question?
So the question actually mentioned a donor, and I want to make the point we do not like talking about donors now. They are participants. Okay.
Yeah,
however,
yeah, it's true.
Yeah, that is true. I read it with the translation by you already saying participant instead of donor. Yes.
Yeah, because
they are,
now you are on board, Monica. You are
I'm on the I'm on the other side.
So, as Sarah said, it's not an issue of recontact. However, because the question says recontact is against the data privacy, but you have to mention when in the initial informed consent form, you are informing the individual that they are going to be recontacted or reconsented. So they have to agree or not agree. Most consent forms actually will specifically ask, do you want to be reconsented or recontacted? Now, obviously, if a child, the child is here assenting, so it's the parents who are going to mark that. Let's not go into that point. But once somebody has signed the consent form and say they want to be recontacted or reconsented, then obviously this isn't against data privacy. Sarah has talked about the issue of anonymization. So I think we've answered this. The other point, oh yes, I think we have.
Okay.
If you anonymize samples, they cannot be traced. So you cannot actually give results to people, and you cannot erase or destroy results. So there is no point in contacting people, and you cannot do it if they are anonymous.
Okay. We will stop here now because we could be asking questions the whole day. It is such a complex topic and it is so rich. It has so many layers, and I'm sure that we will continue talking about it in the future, and we will continue working on it and trying to make resources available to people that are concerned by this topic. Thank you very much, Sara Casati and Bridget Elul, for sharing your knowledge and expertise on this topic with all of us.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you all of you. Thank you a lot.